DND number 5, Angels in Jesus' Name, Chapter 8. On your knees, Tanner, Roberto ordered. He kicked Keegan's cast, and his leg went out for him, and he sank to his knees, grunting in pain. Elizabeth gasped. His leg is broken, you idiots, she blurted out. Keegan's eyes flew to her face. He tried to communicate to her with his eyes to tell her that anything she says is the wrong thing. I told you to be quiet, he said brusquely. Luckily, this time they ignored her. Lizzie glared at him. Her response to them kicking Mike had been automatic. Why she defended him, she had no idea. She hated him. He could burn in hell for all she cares. He stole her children. He shipped them away for money. The evil it would take to do something like that she couldn't even comprehend. Oh, please, Father, where are they? Are they terrified? Are they crying hysterically for me? The business Mike had had with John and Jeff the night they'd come over for dinner, was it to plan the kidnapping of her children? She'd fed them. She'd baked a pie for them. Mike had been so generous offering to pay. Why not? He was about to receive $5 million per child. And he told her to buy something for herself to wear. And my God, it must have been hilariously funny, knowing what he was about to do. The tears spilled over. My babies. Where are my babies? It didn't make any sense. He couldn't have done what it sounded like. He just couldn't have. And who are these men? So, Agent Tanner, or should I say, Special Agent Tanner, let's talk, shall we? Buzzcut said. Keegan shrugged. Knock yourself out. Let's talk about the information you took from us. What about it? We want to know everything you know. Well, I would think that would be obvious by now. The blow came hard and fast, and he grunted as he hit the floor, Lizzie's shocked gasp echoing in his head. Frank and Roberto lifted him none too gently and forced him back on his knees. Blood ran down his chin. Let's just try this again, Buzzcut said calmly. Keegan blew out a breath. Look, you've heard the charges. That's what I know. I know the organization has abducted children and sold them. I know they've ordered hits. I know the names of most of the kids abducted. And I know Senator Hartman is involved. What are you talking about? Elizabeth cried. And why do they keep calling you Agent Tanner? Who are you? Buzzcut swung around to peer at the woman. Unfortunately, Roberto kept his son solidly against Keegan's head. Who do you think he is? Buzzcut asked her, a grin on his face. His name is Michael Moreland. He's a writer. Roberto and Frank laughed. Good one, Tanner. Keegan's jaw clenched, his lips pressed into a thin line. The muscles in the side of his face quivered. Buzzcut narrowed his eyes and turned to study Keegan. She means something to you, doesn't she? Keegan swallowed. There was no good answer. If he denied it, they would assume he was trying to protect her and she was dead. If he confirmed it, she was dead. He chose not to answer old Buzz and speak to Elizabeth himself. Elizabeth, I'm an FBI agent. I've been working undercover to... Frank plowed his fist into Keegan's gut, then backhanded him, sending him sprawling again. As Frank and Roberto lifted him back to his knees, he couldn't help but think about his blood that now stained the carpet and how hard Elizabeth will work at removing it, if she lives. Mr. Hunter asked you a question, Frank sneered. What is she to you, Tanner? He shrugged, raising his shoulder to blot the sweat from his eyes. He needed to be able to see. I did her, he finally said. Who wouldn't? I know that's right, Rocky muttered from his place beside Elizabeth. You horrible, Elizabeth hissed, glaring at Keegan. She couldn't even think of a word bad enough to call him. Hunter turned back to Keegan, no longer interested in the woman. What else do you know? Hunter demanded. You were in Salados's home. You tapped his phones. What did you hear? And who have you told? Nothing else, Keegan stated, glad the attention had shifted back to him. Hunter didn't believe him for a second, though. He nodded at Frank, who swung at Keegan's face again, and Keegan raised his tied hands and blocked the punch, which infuriated Frank. Move again and I'll blow your head off, Roberto said quietly. Frank lit into Keegan. Even after Keegan slumped down on the floor, he continued kicking him, and when Frank and Roberto set Keegan upright once more, he knew this was it. If he lost consciousness, he and Elizabeth would both die. He needed to divide them, and there was only one way to do it. As sweat and blood dripped from his body, he gazed up at Elizabeth. She had tears running down her cheeks. I'm sorry, baby. I'm sorry I got you into this, he said. Lizzie's eyes fixed on his. He said he was an FBI agent. He was working undercover. So maybe he didn't really take her girls. Maybe he was protecting them from these guys. She was suddenly grateful that they weren't here to witness this. Her mind was filled with so much confusion, she had no idea what to say or what to think. Hunter watched the exchange, then moved closer to Keegan. Tell me what else you know, Tanner. I don't know anything else. Hunter turned to the big man in the corner. Rocky, you want to turn with the pretty nurse? You know I do. We'll take her into the next room and show her what you like to do with pretty young nurses. Elizabeth screamed as Rocky reached for her. She kicked and struggled, much as she had when Keegan had tried to get her out of the house. Frank, maybe you better go with him. Hold her down for him. She's a little tigress. Frank grinned at Keegan. I'd be happy to help in any way I can. Keegan watched them leave the room, bile rising in his throat. He had accomplished what he'd intended, though he'd done it at Elizabeth's expense. It had to be done. Now all he needed was for Roberto to look away, just for a second. A split freaking second. Hunter tucked his gun into his slacks and made a show of rolling up the sleeves of his silk shirt. Talk, Agent Tanner, and I'll call him off, Hunter said as he moved forward. But Keegan wasn't listening to him. He'd been listening for sounds from the other room, sounds that Roberto would think were entertaining. And when Elizabeth screamed obscenities and there was a loud crack of flesh hitting flesh, Keegan got the break he needed. Roberto looked up toward the other room, a smile on his face. Keegan moved so rapidly Roberto never knew what happened. Keegan rose, swung behind Roberto. His bound hands covered Roberto's gun hand. Mr. Hunter Buzzcut went for his gun, but Keegan's fingers contracted over Roberto, squeezing off 2 shots. Hunter dropped. Roberto fought Keegan for the gun, twisting until it pointed backward. Then, when he thought he had the shot, he pulled the trigger, and bullets hit the sofa behind Keegan. Enough of that. Keegan took the man down, slammed his hand against the floor, and the gun bounced away, and Roberto produced a knife, and they rolled together, and the knife taking small nicks from Keegan's face, arm, and leg before he was able to maneuver his body to Roberto's rear. Instinctively, Keegan's forearm worked its way around the man's neck, contracted, twisted, the neck snapped. In seconds, Keegan scooped up Roberto's gun and crashed through the twins' bedroom door. Frank drew and fired immediately, hitting the door jamb beside Keegan, but flew backward when a black coal appeared in his forehead. Rocky clambered his way off of Lizzie and advanced. Keegan raised the gun. You're unarmed, so I'm going to give you a chance to live. Get down on your knees. Rocky smiled. That ain't going to happen. He started forward. Back off, you idiot. Rocky grinned at him. Can't nobody take me on and win. Listen, you may be big, but you're no match for a bullet now. Back off. Rocky charged. Keegan fired, hitting him in the gut. The man hesitated, then came forward again. Keegan decided he couldn't take any more chances. His hands were still tied together, so fighting the man would be certain death for him and Elizabeth. He fired again, this time aiming at the head. Keegan didn't miss often, and this time was no exception. Rocky staggered backward. His large body landed next to Lizzie on the bed. Lizzie squealed and unable to move away. Keegan stuffed the gun in his waistband and moved to the small youth bed where Elizabeth lay whimpering. Her blouse was gone, ripped to shreds. Her bra straps were down around her arms. Gently he pulled the bra into place and leaned over her. Elizabeth, I'm an FBI agent, and you have to come with me now. I will protect you. I'll take you to the girls. Please, you have to trust me. Even as he said it, he realized how ludicrous the statement was. With his hands still bound, he helped her to sit up. She was obviously dazed, in shock. Her head turned slowly to look at him. You'll take me to my girls? Yes. But we have to go, right now. He held his hands out to her. Untie me. She nodded, hands trembling. She worked at the knot. A minute later, Keegan was free. I need to get dressed, she said softly, the tears starting anew. There's no time. He pulled his black t-shirt over his head, then turned it and pulled it over hers. Here, wear this for now. Dragging her to her feet, he made sure she was steady. Come on. He led her quietly back to the den where he recovered his possessions, along with his guns and knife, and he took the gun from Hunter's hand. Take a second to run to the kitchen. Taking a second to run to the kitchen table and grab Lizzie's purse, he led her toward the French doors that opened on the backyard. Turning to her, he placed his finger over his lips. They slipped out the door. Keegan had her stand with her back flat against the back of the house. He peeked around the corner. Someone approached. Don't move, he whispered to Elizabeth. The man stepped from the side of the house. Keegan stepped behind him and bashed his head with his gun. He grabbed Elizabeth's hand and pulled. Let's go. They dashed across the darkened backyard, headed toward the woods. They heard someone shout. Shots rang out. Go! Keegan yelled at Elizabeth, shoving her ahead of him. He turned, intending to return fire, but instead took a hit to the shoulder. The force knocked him to the ground, and grunting as he transferred his gun to his left hand, he took aim. In the dimming light, he saw two silhouettes in the yard and one on the porch, all firing in his direction. Then 3 quick rounds came from the woods behind Keegan, and the 3 bad guys went down. A black figure appeared beside him. It's me, Jeff said quickly. Leaning down, Jeff pulled Keegan to his feet. That's some pretty good shooting, Keegan said. Jeff nodded. Yeah, video games. They hurried down the path. When they got to the end, they found Elizabeth leaning on the bumper of the car, trying to catch her breath. Keegan moved up beside her and placed a hand gently on her back. You okay? Sniffing, she shook her head, then leaned over and retched. When she finished, he tried to comfort her, but she jerked away from him. Quietly, she opened the passenger side door and got into the car. I gotta go back, Jeff said to Keegan. There are agents down. They're FBI. I'll come with you. No way. First, you're injured and no good to me. Second, you need to get Liz out of here. I can't let you go back alone. I won't be alone. My Harley friend should be arriving any minute. I'm just going to offer any help I can until the 2 agents are taken care of. And then I have to boogie down to Savannah. Mr. Lee wants me to help watch the docks. You get going. Keegan nodded. Hey, thanks back there. Just doing my job. Are you good to drive? Jeff asked, nodding toward Keegan's shoulder. It's not bad. I think I'll make it. I got a good nurse. Yeah, only I'm not sure she's interested in curing you right now. Good luck on that. Step back here with me a minute. They walked to the back of Jeff's white van. Jeff pulled out a small towel and some duct tape. Wrapping the towel around Keegan's shoulder, he taped it in place. That should put enough pressure on it to get you by for a while. Again, thanks. Jeff extended his hand. See you in Savannah. I'm looking forward to it. Keegan leaned in the driver's side of his car to pop the trunk. He glanced at Lizzie, but she stared straight ahead. He walked back to the trunk, pulled a shirt out of his bag and slipped it on. Next, he removed the boot cast and tossed it in the trunk, retrieved his shoe and pulled it on, and slamming the trunk, he limped around the car and got in. He glanced at Elizabeth, who hadn't moved, and started the engine. The moment they were on the road, he pulled out his cell. Nigel, Tanner, I didn't get out in time with Elizabeth. No, she's alive, but you've got a mess to clean up. I had no help from the agents you sent, so I'm assuming they're down. Jeff Davis went back for them. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Don't know how long it will take. I have to get Mrs. Anderson down to her children, and I'm hit. I may not have to. The information I have is the exchange will take place the week before Halloween. Oh, I'll be there. Yes, sir. He ended the call and tossed the phone into the console. Keegan glanced at Lizzie. She stared straight ahead, her body shivering. Even though she made no sound, the tears continued to flow freely down her cheeks. Most of her hair in the front had torn loose from her ponytail and hung limply beside her face. She made no effort to push it back. There was a bruise on her cheek just below her left eye. He reached over and flipped on the heat, hoping to warm her. It was the least he could do and probably the only thing she'd let him do. They drove in silence. Lizzie glanced over at the man whom she thought she loved. Just a few hours ago, she'd been happily planning a fun family dinner. Family, huh? Daryl had been right. She really should be more careful about who she allows into her home. She knew she should be grateful right now that her original fear had been a mistake. And when she'd arrived home to find Mike, or whoever he is, on the phone, it sounded like he'd sold her children off. He'd said something about 5 blonde children being worth millions of dollars, and the girls were gone. Maybe those men had come to take her girls, and Mike had sent them away to protect them. Then he'd tried to get her out of the house. And she realized now he'd been trying to protect her. It was because of her those men had caught him. He'd taken quite a beating. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He stared straight ahead, wearing a grim, determined expression. His right hand lay on his thigh. His left hand gripped the wheel. His face was battered with bruises and cuts. She'd watched this man kill. He'd shot 2 men right in front of her. The same man whom she dreamed about making love to her. The same man who'd held her so tenderly several nights. How could it be? How could she have fallen so hard and so quickly? He's been lying to her this whole time. He's not Michael Moreland. They called him Agent Tanner. He's a federal agent, and he just spoke on the phone to Nigel, his brother, whom she supposed wasn't his brother at all. Forget all that, she told herself. The important thing is, he's taking her to see her children, who are probably frantic to see her. Keegan glanced over at her and caught her watching him. She raised her chin defiantly. If he wasn't so miserable, the gesture would have made him smile. "Where are my children?" she asked, her voice firm and determined. "They're on their way to Pine Forest. It's a small town in middle Georgia. They'll stay at the Pine Forest Country Inn with John and his wife Jody. They're part owners of the inn." She was quiet a moment while she digested the information. "How long will it take to get there?" "About 4 hours, but we're not going straight there." "Where are we going?" she asked, starting to panic. "I want to see my girls." His jaw clenched. "I know. But I can't make it. I have to stop." "What do you mean you can't make it? Why do we have to stop?" "I'm getting weak." "Weak? Weak from what?" He raised his right hand. His jeans were stained with a large, dark circle where his hand had been resting. "I was hit. I have to stop the bleeding. I'm pulling into a hospital in the next town." Staring at the blood as it dripped from his wrist, she hardened her heart. "Fine. You go to the hospital, but drop me off at a bus station or something. I want my children." She regretted it the moment she'd said it, mostly because of the hurt that appeared in his eyes. "If that's what you want," he said quietly. She didn't respond. The blinker went on, and she watched as he turned left, noting the sign that read, "Monroe, 23 miles. Reaching forward with his wounded arm, he took up his cell phone and pushed some buttons. "Keegan, you okay?" John asked. "A little woozy. I gotta stop. Jeff told me you were hit. He thought you'd be okay. I'm still bleeding. Listen, can you put Heather on the phone? Elizabeth is desperate to speak with the girls." "Sure." "She's pretty upset?" An understatement. "Okay, I'm handing Heather the phone." Keegan handed the phone to Lizzie. "He's getting Heather to the phone." She took the phone and pressed it to her ear, paying no attention to it being covered with blood. She looked into his eyes, and her heart melted a tiny bit. "Thank you." He nodded, lowered his hand back to his thigh. Lizzie put the phone to her ear and waited to hear one of the voices she craved. "Mommy?" Her eyes welled with tears. "Hey, baby, what are you doing?" "We're driving with Mr. John down to a hotel. There's horses there, and cows, too, and Mr. John says Grams is going to let us help her bake chocolate chip cookies." "Grams? Who's Grams?" "She's Miss Lisa's grandma. Miss Lisa owns half the hotel. I don't know which half, but it's on a big farm, and they grow all their own food and stuff, and Grams loves children and has beds all ready for all of us." "That sounds wonderful. How are the twins?" "They're good. Daisy and Lily are asleep right now, but Rose and Violet want to talk to you when I'm finished. And Mr. John got new car seats for everybody, and we had to pack our stuff real fast, but Mr. John says if we forgot anything, he's going to take us to the store and buy us anything we want, and he said we each get to pick out one special thing just for us." "Well, it sounds like Mr. John has it all covered, doesn't he?" She glanced pointedly at the man driving. Keegan cut his eyes to her briefly, letting her know he'd heard her and understood she was still upset. "Yes, Mr. John is so nice, and he's funny, too, just like Mr. Mike. Where are you, Mommy?" "I'm riding in the car with Mr." She turned her head to glare at him. with Mr. Mike, she continued. We're on our way down to the hotel, too, only I'm told it's not really a hotel, it's an inn. What's the difference? Heather asked. Well, actually, there's not much difference. A hotel is probably a little fancier and has more rooms. I'll be there as soon as I can, baby. But if you come too soon, we won't get to do all the things that Mr. John said we could do. Lizzie frowned. I won't keep you from doing all the fun things. You promise? I promise. Okay, well, here's Rosie. She handed the phone to Rose. Well, bye then, she muttered, shaking her head. It seemed her children didn't need her quite as much as she needed them, because it was her who'd been through hell. Luckily, they had no idea of the ugliness she'd encountered. They were off on a grand adventure. Keegan listened as Elizabeth spoke to first Rose and then Violet. Her voice seemed to be getting farther and farther away. He couldn't really make out what she was saying, and it finally dawned on him that he was going down. Bye, Mommy, Violet said cheerfully. Mr. John wants to talk to you. Liz? Yes, she answered coolly. Look, I know you're upset right now. Upset doesn't come close to describing what I feel right now, she said in clipped tones. She looked over at the man next to her as he pulled the car over on the side of the road and turned on the interior light. Turning away, she gave her attention to John. Listen, Keegan didn't want to be placed in your home. Keegan? That's his name? Yes, Keegan Tanner. Special Agent Keegan Tanner. And are you FBI also? No. Keegan and I, we were in the military together, and he needed my help, and I came. And so you're trying to tell me that he didn't want to come to my home to recuperate, but as long as he was there, he thought he may as well have a little fun, huh? That's not how it was, Liz. He took advantage of me, John. You all lied to me. But he... Look, I don't know his specific feelings, Liz, but he cares for you. I know he does. He didn't want to lie to you. He told me he just wanted all this to be over. Oh, it's over all right. Keegan reached out to touch her arm. I need to talk to you. She jerked her arm away. John, I have to go now. I'm sure your buddy appreciates you trying to smooth things out for him. Please, just take care of my girls until I get there. John sighed. Of course. My wife and I will spoil them rotten. She searched for the end button, finally found it, and ended the call, then looked over. What was it? Keegan? What? She said haughtily. I've come up with a better idea. You drive, drop me off at the hospital, and you can drive my car down to the girls. She didn't even blink. Fine. Slamming her door open, she got out of the car and stormed around to the driver's side. Keegan slid over and reached out to pull his door shut. We're almost to Monroe, he mumbled. I hope there's a hospital there, she said. I saw a blue hospital sign back a ways. She nodded, staring straight ahead. I have to tell you something, Elizabeth, he said, his breath labored. Just in case. Lizzie turned to him. He didn't look too good. His complexion was ashen. Perspiration ran down his face. What? What I said back there to those men? I said that to make them think I didn't care about you. They were there to kill me, Elizabeth. I was afraid of what they'd do to you if they knew you meant something to me. Her eyes blinked slowly as she considered what he said. He coughed and ran his good hand over his face. Elizabeth, I love you. I want you to know that. Startled by his declaration, her eyes filled. She watched in stunned fascination as his hand reached out to her. You lied to me. He dropped his hand and drew a ragged breath. I had no choice, Lisbeth. I would have. His body slumped over. Mike? Keegan? Oh, no. She took his pulse, made sure he was breathing, then put the car in gear and took off. Grabbing the cell phone, she kept pushing buttons until she'd called back the last number. She informed John of her destination. 5 minutes later, she pulled up to the local hospital's emergency entrance. Jumping out of the car, she flew through the automatic doors and up to the counter. No one was there. Hello? Is anyone here? Hello? She cried. A woman came from around the corner. Yes, may I help you? Lizzie pointed toward the door. I need help. A man's been shot. The woman swung into action, calling out to her co-workers. Lizzie ran back out to the car, an army of healthcare professionals behind her. New scene. Knees pulled up to her chest, forehead resting against her legs, Lizzie waited. She'd been ushered out to a waiting room. Security had been called, and the man stood nearby just watching her. It seemed as if she'd been there a very long time. When she heard footsteps in the room, she raised her head. 2 police officers approached, and Lizzie straightened in her chair. One officer sat down beside her. The other pulled one of the chairs around to face her. "Ma'am, we understand you brought in the gunshot victim." "Yes, sir," she said, becoming wary. She knew, of course, any gunshot victim brought in, the police were notified. But she'd already told the hospital officials that he was an FBI agent. She'd given them his badge and ID that he'd had on him. What more could they want? One pulled out a small notepad. "Do you have any ID?" "I think it's in the trunk of the car. Would you like me to go look for it?" "We're going to need it. For now, what's your name?" "Elizabeth Anderson." "Ms. Anderson, can you tell us what happened?" "I don't think so. You'll have to talk to his sergeant or captain or whatever they call it in the FBI." "How did you come across him?" She ran her hands over her face, trying to think clearly. If the dead men at her house were sent to kill him, then they could track him down. She wasn't sure what to say, for despite the anger she felt, she didn't want him dead. She was saved from the decision when Nigel Court walked into the room, flashing his badge and taking over completely. "Officers," he said, "you'll need to contact your chief. Until then, no one is to know about the man brought in here tonight, and your question-answer session with Mrs. Anderson is over." The officers left the room fairly fast, leaving Elizabeth alone with Nigel Court. He looked her over. "Mrs. Anderson?" She nodded. "How did you know where we were?" "John Apple called me. Look, I know you've been through quite an ordeal in the past several hours. We're working on removing the mess that was left in your home. If you'd like, I can have a man drive you down to pick up your children. By the time you get back, your home should be habitable." Habitable. Fury burned in her eyes. "Mr. Court, I guess that's your real name?" He nodded. "I don't require your help in any way other than getting those people out of my house and cleaning up the blood. I will only be returning there to pack up and sell. If you think that I can tuck my daughters into bed in the same room where I was assaulted and where Keegan killed 2 men, then you're mistaken. Nor can I sit in the den with my family without seeing those bodies lying on the floor." "Mrs. Anderson, I know you're upset. We had no choice. When we put Agent Tanner in your home, we believed both he and you and your family would be safe." "You believed? You believed?" She was incredulous. "You've met my daughters. How could you even take a chance with their lives?" "We didn't think we were taking a chance. The danger was the same as when you take a drive in your car, completely random." Her eyes narrowed. "I disagree. Now, I'd like for you to leave me alone." He shook his head. "Look, I may have been wrong putting him in your home. He needed a place to recover that was private and out of the way, and if I left him in a hospital or other facility, he would be dead. I was about to put him in a safe house when Dr. Duncan mentioned you were looking for a patient to board in your home. It seemed like the perfect setup. A remote location, a private nurse. I took advantage of the opportunity. That's all there was to it." When she didn't respond, he blew out a breath. "I'll leave you now, but if there's anything I can do, let me know." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm not a bad guy, Mrs. Anderson. I've been working on nabbing these guys a long time. I admit I had a little tunnel vision. They've taken many lives. They've kidnapped hundreds of children, and a United States senator is involved. I wanted them to go down. I wasn't sure if Agent Tanner was turning. He was acting strange, becoming paranoid. Even though I don't think you were in any danger, even though I didn't think you were in any danger, I knew if he thought you were, or your family, in any way, he'd stick it out. I had to be sure he'd stick it out." Elizabeth turned away until she heard him leave the room. Standing, she fished the car keys, Keegan Tanner's car keys, out of her jeans pocket and headed out the door. She went to the trunk to grab his bag and found a suitcase with her clothes and toiletries in it. She realized he must have packed for her. Next to her suitcase was his bag. She grabbed it and slammed the trunk. Heading into the hospital, she asked the woman at the desk to make sure it was delivered to him when he gets out of surgery. Without waiting for a response, she left the hospital, got into the car, and drove away. "Goodbye, Mike," she whispered. New scene. Even though it was morning, Special Agent Keegan Tanner didn't feel like opening his eyes. He was tired, weary, heartsick. Salatos's men had come after him, and as he'd feared, Elizabeth had been hurt in the process. He took a little comfort in the fact that he'd gotten the girls away in time. He supposed she was there by now, down in Pine Forest with the babies. She'd been confused, hurt, and furious. She felt betrayed. He sighed heavily, his brow furrowing. She'd begged him not to hurt her daughters. What the hell? Where had that come from? How could she think he'd hurt the girls? What had been going through her head? He'd find out eventually. First, though, he had to get to Savannah and put a stop to the shipment. He needed to concentrate on matters at hand. He'd never had such a problem taking care of business. He guessed that was because he'd never been in love. More than anything, he wanted to drive down to Pine Forest and force Elizabeth to talk to him until they had it all straightened out, until she understood what he'd done and why, and until she knew he loved her. And yeah, he wanted to know that she still loved him, which he doubted heavily at the moment. Yet all that was impossible right now. First things first, he had to get going. He forced his eyes open, letting them adjust to the light. The first thing he noted was he was back in a hospital gown. Next, he noted the IV, which was going to have to be removed pronto, and then he'd have to have his possessions returned, namely his weapon and badge, which he assumed had been confiscated. Nigel would have been in touch with the hospital administration to clear his way. Hopefully, his clothes were nearby. He glanced around, looking for them, and froze. Elizabeth? She started and stood, came quickly to his bed. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. What are you doing here?" She shrugged. "I'm not sure. I just know I couldn't leave you." His heart soared. "Elizabeth, we need to talk." "Yes, we do. My heart hurts so much, and I'm hoping whatever you have to say is going to make me feel a whole lot better, because I don't know how I can go on living each day, taking care of my girls, feeling the way I do." "I can't believe you're not with them right now." "I've spoken with them twice. They sound as if they don't want me to come, because then I'll ruin all the good fun they're having. I'm not sure how I feel about that." He smiled. "Well, what kid can resist all the things I heard John promise? Especially your sweet girls who've had to get by with the bare essentials." "Exactly. Which is why I'm happy to let them have their fun as long as they're not crying for me. And I was told this morning by John's wife, Jody, that nary a tear has been shed." Keegan started pulling at the tape on the back of his hand. "What are you doing?" "I'm removing the IV. I'm just speeding up the process of getting out of here." He held his hand out to her. "You want to do it for me?" Her lips pressed together and she sighed. "Why not?" Keegan watched her small, soft hands as they gently removed the IV from the back of his hand. His eyes moved up to her mouth, where her teeth pressed into her luscious bottom lip, then moved up to her face, which at the moment was swollen and bruised on one side. He'd killed the men who dared to hurt her, but that wasn't good enough. She looked up at his face. "What?" "I'm sorry, Elizabeth," he said, his voice gruff, "for what they did to you and for what you had to see." She looked down and concentrated on her task and on keeping her hands from shaking. "We'll talk about it, Keegan." "Say it again." "Say what again?" "My name." "I can't tell you how much I've wanted to hear you say my name, my real name. Every time you called me Mike, it was like being stabbed in the heart. Please, say it again." She finished removing the IV, using a piece of the tape and part of the gauze to make a Band-Aid, then stepped back and extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Keegan Tanner." He took her hand and pressed it between his and closed its eyes. "It's wonderful to meet you, Elizabeth Anderson." They gazed into each other's eyes. It was Elizabeth who finally pulled away. I'll go ask for your release papers." She turned and left. Keegan watched her go. He hadn't lost her yet. Maybe her love for him is strong enough to handle all this other muck and mire that he dragged her through. 2 hours later, Lizzie drove Keegan's car away from the hospital with Keegan sitting in the passenger seat. They were headed south toward Atlanta, but didn't get very far when she turned into a motel. "What are we doing here?" Keegan asked. "I left you last night, fully intended to not look back. This is as far as I got. I went in, dropped to my knees, and prayed. And I thanked God that the girls were okay, and I thanked Him that I was okay." She looked into his eyes. "And I thanked Him that you were okay. I asked Him what I should do, and I felt strongly that I should go back for you. So I did. We're staying here tonight, and you're going to tell me everything you have to say." He nodded. She popped the trunk, and he retrieved his bag. Lizzie dug out the room key card and opened the door. Keegan tossed his bag on the queen-size bed and sat down. It was a standard room with an orange and brown spread that matched the room-darkening draperies. One queen-size bed, a dresser with mirror, TV, and the dressing and bathroom areas on the far wall. Lizzie went to the thermostat and cranked up the AC. October in Georgia could mean highs anywhere from 60s to 80s. Today it had to be the latter. "Are you hungry?" Keegan asked, watching her every move. She was walking with a slight limp. There were bruises on her arm and cheek. She wore jeans and a yellow t-shirt, and she'd pulled her hair up into a ponytail. She shook her head, sitting down on one of the two chairs at the tiny table by the window. "Are you? I guess it's lunchtime." "I can wait," he said softly. "I spoke to Nigel Court last night." "Really?" "Yes, he came to the hospital, which was a good thing, because he was able to call off the cops who were trying to interrogate me." Keegan shook his head. "Lisbeth, I am so sorry." "Yeah, you keep saying that." He ran his hands through his hair. "What did Nigel have to say?" "He apologized for putting you in my home and for putting my girls in danger. He said he was only thinking about getting the bad guys." "When I woke up to find myself in your home, Elizabeth, I was livid. I didn't want to be there. I knew you were in danger." "Uh-huh. Still, you could have warned me." He shook his head. "The less you knew, the better off you were. But you could have given me a choice. I would have asked you to leave. I wouldn't have put my girls in danger." "Well, to be completely honest, Elizabeth, once I'd been there a few days, I was afraid of leaving. First, if they'd traced me there, even if I was already gone, they would have hurt you. And then I wouldn't be there to help you. Second," he stopped, his hands falling loosely between his thighs. "Second, I didn't want to leave you. I couldn't bear to leave you." Standing, Lizzie walked around the room. She stopped and peered at him. "I'm waiting to hear, Keegan Tanner, that the entire thing wasn't a lie." He stood and went to her and took her hands. "Elizabeth, I fell in love with you. I've never said that to another woman. I love you. That night you told me how you felt about me, I started to tell you then, but I wanted you to hear it from Keegan Tanner, not from some name the Bureau made up for me. All I could think about was getting this thing over and starting a life with you." Her eyebrows shot up. She pulled away from him. "Maybe you'd better tell me everything, from the beginning." He sat next to her. "Maybe you're right." And that is the end of chapter 8.